recording will start soon. Does that mean it started now? Okay, now we're being recorded. Cool. Okay, so yes, welcome everyone. So if you have questions, comments, if you just want to talk to each other, that's fine. Throw it together or post into the chat below, and I will respond in line. I try to watch the chat as I go through the presentation. Cool. So thank you for joining. And if you're watching this sort of after the fact, thanks for watching. This will be posted to YouTube probably. Anyway, so the intent of this is I want to go over, I've had a lot of success using FOIA over the past year and a half to sort of find stories, write about stories. And I've had a lot of failures too. And part of what I want to talk about is how you can participate in this. It seems intimidating, and it is intimidating at first. So let me just jump in. I've got some slides here, and I hope you enjoyed the smooth jazz I played as we were getting ready here. No more smooth jazz. Next slide. There we go. Cool. So just about me, real quick. I live here in Evanston, in the 3rd Ward. I'm originally from Michigan. Well, I'm going to shrink this just a little bit so I can see the chat. I own my own business. In addition to doing FOIA GRA, which doesn't really pay the bills, I own my own business in the corrosion industry. If any of you guys have corrosion issues, give me a call. I don't have any formal journalism training. Everything I'm going to talk about today is sort of learned on the job. I do have some college degrees. I dropped out of a PhD at Northwestern. My formal training is as a software engineer, but I've become better in some soft skills over the past few years. And just a disclaimer: none of this is legal advice. I'm not a lawyer. You shouldn't take legal advice from me anyway. But hopefully this, again, my intent is to help set you up with some of the skills to be able to do FOIA requests yourself, and to be able to participate in the project and participate in FOIA. So a little bit about the history of me and this operation, FOIA GRA. It was founded in August 2022. I started the blog because there was a lot of drama happening in District 65, and there were a lot of conspiracy theories, and I wanted to investigate them. And I really didn't have a ton of experience with FOIA. I was sort of familiar with it. But I made a lot of mistakes along the way, some of which I'll share here. I hosted on Substack, which is whatever. Substack is fine. And we're almost to 1,000 followers now, which is pretty cool. I haven't posted in a while. I've had a little bit of writer's block, but we're plugging along. So let's talk about what FOIA is. So fundamentally, FOIA stands for Freedom of Information Act. It is a law. It is a statute on the books at the state level. And I'm going to be talking mostly about Illinois in this call. I know I have some readers that are not in Illinois. I'm going to be talking almost entirely about Illinois' FOIA law. It is the one I am most familiar with. And it is also a federal statute. So we'll talk a little bit about the federal statute too, which is a little bit more complicated. The state FOIA law applies to pretty much any state organization. That's universities, school boards, the governor's office, city councils, police departments, fire departments, local governments, library districts, water, all that stuff. It falls under the purview of the state FOIA law, the Illinois FOIA law. There's also a federal FOIA law, which applies to anything that's Department of X. Pretty much any executive branch, including the Department of Defense, falls under the federal FOIA. FOIA law does not apply to Congress. You cannot FOIA Jan Schakowsky. It does not apply to courts in the judiciary, so you can't FOIA, someone. They have separate records laws on the books. Here's the Illinois statute. I actually really like how the Illinois statute begins. Especially the first paragraph, I think is very, very nice. Pursuant to the fundamental philosophy of the American constitutional form of government, it is to be declared that the public policy of the state of Illinois, that all persons are entitled to full and complete information regarding the affairs of government and the official acts and policies of those who represent them as public officials and public employees consistent with the terms of the act. Anyway, I think it's a very nicely well-written act in terms of, different state FOIA laws. And we'll talk a little bit, I will explain a little bit about some of the limitations. They even explain some of the limitations here in the beginning. It's not intended to cause unwarranted invasion of personal privacy, nor allow requests of a commercial enterprise to unduly burden public resources. So you'll see there are a lot of limitations. There's a tendency, I think, among people who get involved in this, and then get involved with submitting FOIAs, that you can just sort of blanket get stuff. It doesn't work like that. It's actually, you have to be very specific. So what are your rights? FOIA is a law which is granting you as a citizen some rights. And fundamentally, it grants you the right to solicit copies of records from government agencies, subject to certain restrictions. So specifically, what I mean when I say copies of records, the big thing is you cannot, and we'll talk about this, the government will not do work for you. So you cannot say, hey, sometimes you can try this and maybe it'll work. You usually cannot say, hey, give me a report of everyone whose last name starts with H, first letter starts with T. Usually cannot get them to do unique research for you. But if a record exists, you are entitled, subject to certain restrictions, to have access to that record. And I'm going to use a little bit of terminology in this talk. A request. You are making, as a FOIA filer, you are going to be making a request, and the public body will be giving you a response. That's kind of the language I'm going to use. Sometimes I say reply, but it's a sort of a call and response system where you're going to request some data and they're going to reply with something, maybe in denial, maybe something else. And I'll talk about this again too. Different government agencies have different processes. I've seen a million different ways to do this. Generally, it's either a web form or a web system or some type of system where you submit a request. And the Evanston Police, for instance, have a pretty decent system where you go in, type what you want, and they have a whole workflow that's online. In some places, you have to email an officer, not a police officer, like the FOIA officer, who we'll talk about in a second. In other places, you got to print a form, fill it out, scan it, and send it back. So there's different ways to do it. So what should be included in a request, right? So, you want access to some data or you want to view some record. What do you need to provide? I've seen people submit FOIA requests with completely anonymous emails and everything, and I guess that's an option. But at the bare minimum, the request should include your name, and at least your email address. That's sort of sufficient nowadays to submit a FOIA and get a response. You don't have to be honest with your name and email address. You can create an anonymous email address, anonymous name. They're still sort of required to file it. I think including your address, though, I always include my real name, my real address, and my real email address. I tend to think that it's probably going to be prioritized. Your FOIA will be prioritized if it's being received by somebody. If you're submitting it to the Evanston City Council or something, I get the sense that FOIAs to local people will be prioritized first. I don't know if that's true, but I sort of feel like it is. You should always provide a specific list of the records you're seeking. And one thing I want to note is that providing background information, appendices, pictures is very helpful. Sometimes their tools won't give you the ability to do it. And we'll talk about what some of those records might look like. If you search for how to make a FOIA request, sometimes they'll tell you, include, the type of, everything's digital now. Like any response will be digital. No one's mailing FOIA anymore. The type of request, if you're making it for a media, if you're going to publish it, you should let them know. If it's commercial, you should let them know. So commercial meaning you're making a request for a business use. So for instance, if you look through FOIA logs, one thing you'll see is that people, especially with school districts, for instance, photographers are always FOIAing contracts from their competitors. That would be a commercial request. Or I've made commercial requests on my business where I've requested certain types of data from the government, from the Department of Defense or from the Department of Commerce. Those are commercial requests. And it's usually helpful if you ask them, if there'll be a cost, let me know in advance. I've yet to encounter a case where there's a cost involved. I think since things are digital now, most of the photocopying costs are essentially a thing of the past. One thing that's come up a lot is, are there consequences for you as a person filing a FOIA? Can you get in trouble, right? Like anytime you're interacting with the government, there's always some risk things go sideways. And in general, FOIA entitles you to a lot of rights, and it's a pretty liberal bill. And so there are some limitations on how many FOIAs you can submit. Those numbers are pretty high. So I've got them in here. It's 7 FOIAs within 7 days, 15 requests within 30 days, or 50 within a year. So I've never even gotten, I file a fair number of FOIA, and that's an individual government entity, not sort of across many. So it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard to beat that or to surpass that. In that case, if you do become a recurrent requester, it's called, there are limitations on how many more you can file, and so on. And there are also requests within an individual sort of request, or there are limitations within an individual request itself. So for instance, if I was to FOIA, if you were to say, if you're FOIA a school district and say, I want every email from every teacher, technically those are public records, but they would deny that as being unduly burdensome. You're asking for too much information. And that can be kind of more of an art than a science. But yeah, it's pretty hard to hit the limits. It's a pretty generous bill. And when it comes to limits, and when you get close, especially when you get into the unduly burdensome case, it's a denial of a specific request, and then you just have to refile it or something. You should be aware that FOIAs are public information. So the fact that you filed a FOIA is itself public information, and the request and reply that you made is itself public information. So sometimes it's helpful to FOIA other people's FOIAs. The school district here, this is in District 65 here in Evanston. You can see, here is every school board meeting. They publish a list of FOIA requests, and you can go through and see if there's anything interesting. And then you could actually FOIA one of those records that has already been FOIA'd. I sometimes like doing that because I think that's probably very low burden work for the public body. They've already filled the FOIA. They just got to make a copy of it and send it to me. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. It's usually a decent strategy though. But almost every organization, even the federal government, will publish a list of people that have made FOIA requests. But in general, it's pretty low risk in terms of you can't really get in trouble. But government itself is increasingly considering FOIA more of a nuisance for a broad range of reasons. One is that if you look at FOIA logs, even especially to school districts here, like here in Evanston, increasingly conservative legal groups are weaponizing FOIA to own their enemies, for lack of a better word. And you can go through, here's an example at the very bottom here. Carabelle of Judicial Watch requested communications and records identifying plans to prioritize students for in-person school for the 2020. So that's a national, that's not a local group, that's a national conservative media group. And so, that becomes a challenge when you have partisan groups sort of bombing out FOIAs to every district asking for things. And I've even gotten critical feedback from some school board and public officials here in Evanston that my FOIAs have been cumbersome or numerous. Which I would defend as not being the case. But FOIA is intimidating to public officials, and it's and increasingly I'm starting to see more action and more. There was a Time story I don't know a while ago about one of them's in here about sort of like more and more limitations are being added to the types of records you can FOIA. So what does a record look like? This is sort of the most standard type of FOIA request that I make, and I think that is made. Generally, I put together a letter in Google Docs or whatever. You can see the letter on the right. I attach it to an email and I send it to the FOIA contact that's listed on their website. So you can see here, this is me requesting some records from District 69 about a middle school building. And this is the most standard way to do it. I can send you a template, or you can just go to ChatGPT, say, generate a FOIA template for me, and it'll generate one. I copy and paste my signature in there, I attach it to an email as a PDF, and I send it off. That's sort of the most I would say 90% of, well, we'll talk about most local governments do it this way, where they have a FOIA officer that you can email. I should add that every governmental body is required to have a FOIA officer, which is someone that receives your FOIAs, inspects them and fills them, denies them, takes action on them. And almost in every case, I've yet to encounter a case where it is not available on a website. It's almost always available on a website. Here's another example. Some places require you to fill out a form. So District 65 here in Evanston requires you to fill out a form. I think that's totally reasonable. I had to buy a scanner, but I fill out a form, I scan it in, and I attach it to an email as a PDF and send it off. One thing I like to do is I like to include the date in the email subject line. So I'll say FOIA request and then the date, and that will sort of set a timer. So we'll talk about how the timing works. And then here's sort of the last case, which is larger entities. So CPS, for instance, here is the CPS portal for FOIA. Larger entities, the federal government, CPS, Evanston, like Evanston as the city, will use some type of portal. I actually like the portals a lot. Some of the portals will let you actually view other people's requests, so you can go through and see the things that other people have requested, and you can see the response in the portal. That's a luxury. Usually not the case, but another example, most state agencies also have portals. So I end up submitting a lot of FOIA requests to the Illinois State Board of Education. They have a pretty decent portal too. Timeline. Oh yeah, and I see some people typing in the chat. Feel free to throw questions in the chat. I see the chat as I'm talking here, so I'll try to address questions as they come along, and we can also address questions at the end too. How long does a response take? So I thought about this slide a lot. The answer is it depends. In my experience, so probably over the course of the last year, I've probably filed, I don't know, on the order of 50 FOIA requests to different agencies, among probably a dozen different agencies. How long does it take? Usually, well, the best case is same day. There have been some districts where I've requested a financial record and gotten that same financial record back in one day. That's not usually the case. I think that's only happened once or twice. Worst case, you'll never get a response. So I'll talk about a couple examples where that's happened. It's a thing. The average case is the maximum number of days statutorily allowed. So in general, the federal government has a 20-day period. After 20 days, 20 business days, after 20 business days, they are required to send you a letter, and then they can take as much time as they want. And we'll talk about that in a second. The state of Illinois has a sort of a two-tiered system where they have 5 days to get back to you. And then they can say it's going to take another 5 days, or they can say, or they can deny it. They have to get back to you in 5 days, and they can also get another 5-day extension. So usually in the state of Illinois, they'll ask for that. Most organizations will ask for that extension, and it'll take 10 days. And so these are 10 business days. So, and business day being defined as the public body's business day. So with a school district, for instance, you have to keep in mind that, if you're going to submit the FOIA right before the holidays, the business days might stop for 2 weeks and then restart when the holidays are over, or when there's more breaks for a school district than, say, the city of Evanston. Usually you can expect a response, and this is why I like to put the date into the subject line, because it helps me sort of keep track of, I submitted this on 10/23. When can I get a response back? I see a question. Can I use someone else's FOIA information? Yes, you can 100% FOIA someone else's FOIA. I do this all the time, and I actually think it's good practice. I think it is very little work for the government. You have to keep in mind, a lot of these folks that are working as FOIA officers for a public body are not, this is not their full-time job. Like FOIA is, they're the FOIA officer, but they're usually some other job, like a board secretary or some type of administrative role. And so, every FOIA request you submit is creating work for this other person. So I try to keep them as simple as possible. So, I would definitely recommend if you see someone else you see in the monthly board meeting that there's a really interesting looking FOIA, just FOIA a copy of that, and it's very easy. And let me know if that didn't answer your question. And so, yeah, so they're usually pretty quick. I sort of think of them in a way, some of the FOIAs as planting seeds though, because sometimes it feels like it takes forever. 5 business days adds up pretty quick, especially with a school district that will have lots of breaks. It adds up pretty quick. Some organizations are fast. The city of Evanston has almost never hit the 5-day period. They usually fill it faster. But Chicago, for instance, if you're FOIAing records from CPS or the city of Chicago, like you're going to hit the 10 days. And, it's also possible you just never get a response. So, there was a case where I am still waiting for a response. I FOIA'd some data from, I FOIA'd a letter. In this case, it was a letter issued to District 65 from the federal government, from the Department of Education. This letter was mysteriously revoked. And so I FOIA'd some records that pertained to that letter. I received a 20-day notice from the federal government, which says we've taken 20 days and we might take longer, on February 28th, 2023. So we're almost a year later and I still haven't gotten a response. I followed up and asked for timelines and everything and just crickets. So you say this seems unjust, and the answer is it is. And so what are my options? My options are to sue. And with the federal government, I could perhaps contact the Department of Ed Ombudsman or something like that. But with the federal government, especially, like, your options are to sue. And that can be expensive. In this case, I spoke with a lawyer and it was not terribly expensive, but it was $2,500 essentially for them to take the case. So, you have to do, when you get a denial, you have to do this cost benefit math of, well, is this case interesting enough to pursue? Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. It's just it's an art in a way. Here's a story from the New York Times where they submitted a FOIA in 1997, and then it finally got filled 20 years later. So, the federal government, especially, again, you have to sort of do this math of, like, if they're just not responding to me, what recourse do I have? And sometimes the options are not great. If you have more money, if you're a newsroom, you can afford to hire lawyers sometimes. But as an individual, it's tough. I haven't encountered a single case where local government, where anyone under the jurisdiction of the Illinois FOIA law has iced me like this. There's actually fines if they do that in the state of Illinois. And so I haven't encountered a single local government. I've encountered them denying FOIAs for reasons I think are not right. But I haven't been straight up iced like the federal government will do that to you. So talking about denials, there are a lot of reasons they can deny your FOIA. And so again, I think a lot of people approach this as, and certainly I did when I started, as this sort of blanket law that will allow me to get any records from a public entity. Like, hey, this is a public entity. I'm a taxpayer. I'm entitled to see all of these things. I'm entitled to see the internal operations of this government entity. And the answer is you're not. FOIA is a very sort of limited law that says if there are records that don't meet a bunch of criteria, you can see that record. You can have that record. So there's reasons for denial are called exemptions. And so there are a lot of reasons you can a particular record can be exempt from FOIA. Some of them are kind of obvious, I think, are straightforward. So certain types of law enforcement records are exempt from FOIA, particularly about criminals, or someone's, and some of it sort of starts to get into, well, is this a court record or is this a law? I don't do too much with law enforcement. Some things are also obvious, I think, like, the architecture, the blueprints for the prison, for instance, are not FOIA-able records. Maybe they should be. I don't know, but they're not FOIA-able. Other things are really interesting. There was a really interesting case a while ago where some students had FOIA'd copies of their exams. Some college students had FOIA'd copies of their school exams, and so school exams were added to the exemption. So you can't FOIA university. You can FOIA university records. You can't FOIA you can't FOIA your finals this year. There's also other exemptions for research that's in progress. The university world has a fair number of exemptions. You cannot FOIA records which contain personally identifiable information. So, there is a redaction that can happen. So you could FOIA, I'm trying to think of a good example. You could FOIA like a record that might contain a person's home address. I'm trying to think of an example, maybe like a credit card bill or something. And they can redact out. And, this happens a lot this happens a lot if you FOIA police reports. Police reports will redact out a lot of the personal information from the report, but you can still get the report. And Evanston Police, their credit, does a really good job at this. And that's actually true with almost all police reports. They'll redact out most of the interesting information not interesting, but most of the personal information and give that to you. Closed session records, so things involving personnel, so you can't FOIA what they talk about in closed session. Bids and proposals in a lot of cases, like there have been a lot of cases of competitors. The government is doing some kind of RFP. People are FOIAing their competitors' bids and so on. There's limitations around that, especially if it results in collusion or something that's going to cost the government a lot of money. You can't FOIA the government's information security assessments, stuff like that. I'm going to talk about two big ones that are here in the state of Illinois that I run up into all the time. One, which is records that are pre-decisional, meaning, I'll talk about it in a minute. And the other pertains to records which are covered by federal law, and that law usually is the copyright law. So there are other federal laws that get in the way of FOIA. So things like FERPA with student records, for instance, sort of supersedes FOIA. So you can't FOIA something that's covered by FERPA, like student. I can't FOIA some other kid's grades, right? Those are sort of the two big things I run into. So let's talk about the first one. So pre-decisional. So this is sort of a weird one that I didn't realize existed. People talk about this in the federal. If you watch, if you followed any of the Trump news for the last 4 or 5 years, or last 8 years, this can be thought of as executive privilege in a way. You cannot FOIA records which are preliminary drafts, notes, recommendations, memos, and other records which become part of a policy. Except when it's publicly cited and identified by the head of a public body. So that can become a very complicated exemption. But this can be interpreted quite liberally. I wrote literally in there, liberally, in the sense that, in some way, if you were a public body, you could say, well, one thing that people are, and myself included, are always interested in is what process did a public body go through when bidding out work, right? So suppose the city of Evanston is hiring a contractor to build a park. I think it's a very interesting public story to say, well, what process did they follow through? Did they go through to put out RFPs, to talk about, was there private discussion about the vendors that applied? That stuff is actually exempt from FOIA, so you cannot get those records. Here's an example that I had denied under the pre-decisional case, which I think I would argue is wrongfully denied, but it was denied under the pre-decisional umbrella, which is I was requesting, here is a copy of my request. I was requesting information related to the bus savings for the Fifth Ward School. So in Evanston, they cited a $3 million savings. And there's a slide that was presented that said source D65 business office. And I said, I would like, I FOIA'd a copy of those records, right? So I said, emails from people in the business office to anyone at Raymond James between these dates, which pertain to student bus riders, potential savings, and or student reassignment potential savings. This was denied. This was denied for pre-decisional. I think this is an unfair denial. I don't think these records are pre-decisional. So that leads up to the next question is what recourse do I have? And the reason I disagree that these are pre-decisional is facts are not considered pre-decisional. So if someone, if there was an email that was like, hey, what is your opinion on what is your professional opinion on what this number is? That person can tell you, and that record, that email, for instance, would be protected under this exception. But if it's a fact, you hire a data scientist who runs some numbers and they provide you with that number, that is not pre-decisional. That's a fact. I don't believe that falls into the preliminary draft note, recommendation memo, or other records. So in which opinions are expressed. So I think there's a lot of cases where you request a record and the denial is sort of fuzzy, and you then have to ask yourself, well, what recourse do I have? And I'll talk about the two options you have. Generally, you can sue. You can hire a lawyer. You can sue. This is the quick route. Or you can try to work through the Illinois Attorney General. They have an office that handles these, and I'll talk about the PAC office in a second. Here is another example of why not most of my FOIAs, but another major reason why my requests get denied, and it has to do with this is exemption A, which is federal, just like sort of blanket, like anything covered by federal law is not subject to being requestable. And copyright is a federal law, and that is a big reason for denial. And so here's an article from the Wall Street Journal about a parent in Pennsylvania who tried to FOIA a copy of some of the professional development materials that were being provided to teachers. And the district denied it. They said this FOIA this record is not subject to FOIA. It is covered by copyright, and it is owned by the vendor that provided these professional development services. I run into this all the time. In fact, this is not uncommon. You can imagine FOIA. I would like to see a copy of my child's textbook. You can FOIA that, and it will be denied because that textbook is covered by federal copyright. Do you have recourse? The answer is, again, you can sue. You can reach out to the Attorney General, who I'll talk about. And in this case in particular, there is some evidence that there have been some administrative rulings that suggest you have the right to inspect those records, even if it's covered by copyright. You have the right to. You can request FOIA. They can deny you, but then you can appeal and say, you know what? According to, and if you're curious, I can share the letters with you. According to these administrative rulings, I do have the right to go inspect these records. And that means inspect means you're going to the office, sitting at a table, someone's letting you flip through the textbook. It doesn't make for good reporting, but you do have the right. People want to see the original documents. It doesn't make for good reporting. And so, here's another example where I requested a copy of materials. A District 65 board member was consulting with another school district, and I had tried to FOIA copies of the materials that she used in this training with District 73 with another school district. And they denied the request. They partially filled the request. I requested a copy of a contract and some other stuff, but when it came to the materials, they denied it. Should refer to Section 6 copyrights and Section 9 intellectual property. Those were the sections of her contract, but functionally this was a Section A, an exemption, a Section 7A exemption, which is saying, those records you requested are covered by copyright, and you would have to get either her permission to see this, or if I wanted to really go to battle over this, which I didn't, I could go and I could probably claim the right to go inspect these records. And so again, you sort of have to do this sort of balancing act. So what recourse do you have if you're denied? So you generally have four options. You can do nothing. I mean, this is probably what I do most of the time. If I have a denial, sometimes it's fair. Sometimes sometimes it's borderline, like the case where, like, I think, it's like borderline in the case of some of the pre-decisional stuff. You can do nothing. You can say, okay, I'm just not going to get this record. You can reword it, or you can change the request. Sometimes you'll request something, it'll be denied for being overbroad, and you will have to zoom in a little bit more. Sometimes you'll have to go back and do more research and say, well, I requested too much. let's try to find a more specific set of dates, a more specific, try to narrow it down some and try again. You can appeal to the Illinois Public Access Counselor. So the Illinois Attorney General has an office called the Public Access Counselor who mitigates disputes over FOIA requests, and they mitigate disputes over Open Meeting Act violations. Talk about that again. You can hire a lawyer and you can sue. Again, it's expensive. Like, there are lawyers out there in Illinois that will do pro bono work for Illinois FOIA cases. You know, I can provide some names if you're interested. But they're picky and choosy what they take. You know, if you're a lawyer doing pro bono FOIA work, like, you want to take a case so you'll get paid at the end. So there are fines to public bodies that do not comply with FOIA. And that's how these lawyers get paid. So they'll take it on a contingency basis, but they won't take borderline cases. They'll take cases that are slam dunks, where they know they're going to get paid. And they'll do that pro bono. But if you want to hire that, and you know, you can hire them to do a case not pro bono, but it's expensive. You know, at least in my experience, you're starting off at $2,500 just to get started. Most of the time you're out of luck, and you need to decide the math, and you need to say, is this worth it? You know, maybe you've got a story that's a huge bombshell or something that's really, really surprising or newsworthy. It might be worth going further. It might be worth proceeding. And so I'll talk about the Public Access Counselor. So the Illinois AG has this thing called the Public Access Counselor. They reconcile these things. They reconcile disputes. Their decisions are published in these things called PAC letters. And you can go on the website and view some of them, but there's actually a lot more that are not viewable. And you can email the Public Access Counselor and say, hey, I'm looking for letters which pertain to X, Y, or Z, and they'll provide it to you. Sometimes they take some time. Here's an example of what this is, a letter from the Evanston Roundtable I dug up. I don't remember what it was about, but you know, if you feel like something's been improperly denied, you can request it. So here's an example of that, where I ran into this wall, and you know, I had requested, I had a copy of District 65's purchasing card, and on the purchasing card were two expenses, one for a hotel room and one for an auto repair. That seems newsworthy to me, so I requested it from the district, and they denied it. And they denied at least two of the records for being records for a homeless student, which is plausible here in Illinois. School districts do have some latitude to provide housing for homeless students, housing and transportation. Actually doesn't call. What's interesting is the law here in Illinois doesn't permit, for instance, paying for auto repairs for a student's family. And so I responded, I challenged this. I took this to the Public Access Counselor, and I said, one, how do I know this is for a homeless student? Like, I feel like the district should be required to demonstrate that this fact that they're telling me is true. I shouldn't just take it at face value. And two, you know, there should be records, and this is what I'm requesting, records which are copies of receipts or documents provided. So the state's ability, you know, when the district requests under this law where the district can, you know, pay for housing for a homeless student, they get reimbursement for the state. So there must be some reimbursement record that's out there that can be redacted and so on. So I sent that to the Illinois AG, the PAC office, in November 2022. I appealed. The district replied to me in December 2022. You know, January 23, I replied to their decision, and here we are, January 2024, and we have nothing, total radio silence from the PAC office. So the reason for that is they are completely overwhelmed. So, you know, I emailed them many times over the last year, and I'm like, hey, what's the status on this? What's the status on this? And you're assigned a PAC contact. And they're overwhelmed. And her answer was essentially, this stuff takes time. Thanks for your request. You know, be patient. That's fine. I mean, the story to me is now dead. You know, if the district used, you know, the story to me was there a case where the district was using public funds to repair an employee's car? Was this really an employee, or was this a homeless student? And I think it's in the public, domain to want to know that information. But now the story's moved to me, and I might as well wait for the PAC to rule on the Public Access Counselor to rule on this, because maybe there's still something there I can write about, maybe not. But the challenge is the appeal process, at least with the state of Illinois, is totally broken. The PAC office used to not take so long, but now I think after COVID, they've been totally swamped with Open Meeting Act violations, which was a big issue during COVID. And I think I don't know if they're a good recourse. I don't think I would submit appeals to the PAC anymore. I think at this point, like if I have a PAC or if I have a FOIA request that's denied, essentially my only path is to sue to get it. I just don't. The PAC might be able to resolve some very obvious cases, but there's not very obvious denials. Almost all the denials are borderline types of things, and that's sort of where we're at here. So here's some examples of good and bad FOIAs, and I want to make sure I end in about 5 minutes so I have time for questions. At least I just pulled these off of a list from a couple months ago. An example of a good one. X from the State Volunteer for Change the Air Foundation requested the latest IAQ and environmental testing for schools, a report that includes mold spore sampling data for each school. I think this is a good FOIA request. You're requesting a specific record. This organization probably is aware of the testing requirements. Here's another example. X requested contract copies with argument-centered education. Again, you're requesting a very specific record that exists, a contract or an invoice or something like that you can say relatively confidently exists. X requested copies of all contracts, invoices, and purchase orders, and the employment contractor for Dr. Horton. Again, very specific records. Here's some that I don't think are so good. X requested every email sent to and from each member of the school board for the last 3-month period. Yada, yada. This is not a good FOIA request. The district is not going to fill it. It's overbroad. There's exemptions all over the place for probably student information. It's just not going to be filled. It's a waste of everyone's time. Here's another example. This one is filed by, this is my first FOIA request. X requests emails, documents, and communications related to the hiring of a new principal at Lincoln Elementary. It's not going to be filled. There's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of exemptions. It's overbroad. It includes a lot of personnel information. It's a waste of everyone's time. So I've got a couple tips I want to sort of suggest that have been successful for me that I think might be successful for you if you're out there. Submitting FOIAs, request very specific records. I think that's what makes a good FOIA request. Of course, that means you need to know the record exists, right? Like that becomes part of the challenge. We'll talk about that in a second. All emails between person X and Y will be denied as being overbroad. Unless there's one email between those people, it'll be denied for being overbroad. So you're going to have to narrow your request and request a record that exists. They're not going to do They're not going to do research for you. Number 2, financial records are king. I think this is true in the federal and also in the state records laws. Financial records are king. You will absolutely have more success if you're requesting financial records, copies of invoices, copies of checks, copies of contracts, those types of records, copies of reports out of the financial systems. If you can figure out what they're using, those types of reports are almost always filled, and there is a lot of support in the law for those types of records as being sort of like the top. Of course, this means you have to spend some time potentially to understand how the district or how the public body you're FOIAing keeps their records and retains them. It can be a hard, time-consuming thing to do. Tip number 3, play by the rules. Public bodies will set up a framework, follow their framework, be nice to the FOIA officer. It's not usually even their main job. Number 4, I think this is the most important one, use records to get records. If you are looking for if you are looking for a record and you don't know if it exists or not, you're going to have to dig around a little bit. And there's plenty of public records, not via FOIA, just from board meetings that are lush with information. So here's an example, a contract for Scholastic with a funding source. And you're like, what's that funding source ID? I wonder what else is part of that funding source ID. So then you can FOIA, hey, I would like a report of this funding source ID and every check paid. And usually there's some kind of report like that exists or has existed, and you can get that. So I think using existing things, lists of bills, lists of new contracts, board meeting minutes, speeches to like find identifiers, records, the idea of the record exists, very, very important. Number 5, don't use FOIA as a political weapon. If you don't like your kid's teacher or you don't like the politics or whatever, don't just blanket FOIA the word woke. I see these all the time in the District 65 requests with national media organizations trying to dig up anything they can find to report sort of stories that I think are really not even, they're non-stories, or to badger private employees. Don't do it. FOIA is meant as a governance tool. It's meant as a tool to provide citizens access to governance and transparency in the operations of their government. It's not necessarily meant as a tool to own your enemies. FOIA was not passed in the spirit of owning the enemy. It was passed in the spirit of transparency. And so your request should focus, I really strongly believe, around that. Cool. I wanted to end with 10 minutes. So if people have questions, they can chime in. I'm going to enable, I guess, I don't know how to do this. I guess questions probably would be better if you threw them in chat, because it gets kind of unwieldy with too many people in microphones. So throw questions in here, and I'd be happy to answer. Otherwise, I'm going to post this online, and I will just post a link into the, I'll make a story on FOIA Gra about this, and people can comment on there. My commenters get a little spicy sometimes, so people will comment and discuss stuff on there too, which might be a good forum. And I think I'm also going to post this video on YouTube. And here's my email. You can email me. You can dig up my address and some FOIA requests. Come knock on my door if you want. But this is so yeah, fire away any questions you guys might have. Otherwise, we'll give it a minute. Otherwise, I'll make you listen to smooth jazz again. Don't come knock on my door. Don't actually come knock on my door. But send me an email first. Questions. Questions? Okay. Well, I hope you guys all have a good afternoon. Again, if you want private questions, you can email me. I'll post this publicly. Thanks for attending, and thanks for being a reader of my blog if you read it. And yeah, so everyone have a good afternoon. I will actually share the slides right now. There you go. Thanks, everyone. Go back to the smooth jazz now.